In this video, we're talking about computer roles, and I don't mean like ham and cheese rolls. Okay, bad joke, sorry. So, computers on a network can take on a particular role, and think of these roles in terms of an actor, right? So when someone acts, they take on a role, and that actor might not necessarily play the same role every time. Right, Leonardo DiCaprio played many different roles, but not all at the same time. It's exactly the same with computers. So we're going to talk about a computer when it's behaving as a client, when it's behaving as a server, and when it's behaving as a peer. So what do we mean by those terms? Let's have a look. So a computer acting as a client is one that sends requests to a server on a computer network. So for example, your computer, when it's behaving as a client, might request a web page from a web server. And if you're sending an email, it will send the email to an email server to then ultimately forward on to another client somewhere that then receives the email. I've got a diagram here which shows a client tweeting out a message. So when you send out a tweet, your computer is behaving as a client, and it sends that tweet to a server, so one of Twitter's servers somewhere, which would then need to validate your sign-in, store and moderate the message. And then another client can then pick up your message from the server. So a client is a computer that's sending a request to a server. So what about the server? What's the role of a server? Well, I've already mentioned that in the case of Twitter, but what does it do? Well, it processes those requests from the clients. And as part of that processing, it might either allow or disallow that client from performing that particular action. So in the case of Donald Trump sending an angry Twitter message that's not particularly factual, Twitter might not like that. So it might decide that violates its terms and then doesn't allow that tweet to appear. Whether or not you think that's right or wrong is another matter entirely. So the server is usually a central store of data, or provides some kind of central service. So a computer acting as a client is one that sends a request to a server to perform some form of action. A computer acting as a server is one that processes those requests from the clients, and it controls access to its services. So what's the kind of benefits of using this model? Well, when you think about it, Twitter wouldn't exist without all of its servers. The same with Instagram and all these other social media websites. So they're a pretty good way of being able to share information and data between lots of different clients. Servers can be used to moderate content, which could be good. It might not be bad. It might not be good depending on who sets up those policies. And of course, when you're using Instagram, you don't really have to think about, oh, well, who's applying all the security fixes to the server, who's making improvements, etc. That's all done by some kind of third party, which takes care of all of that for you. But of course, what are the drawbacks? Well, for the people setting up the servers, it can be an expensive business to be involved in. So as a business, if you're setting up some kind of service, then you're going to need some pretty hefty, powerful servers to be able to do that. And of course, that involves some form of maintenance and administration, setting up different users, user permissions, sorting out security issues, and so on. So if you're on the setting up side, it can be quite a long process. Of course, if any server fails, then the whole system fails. Now, we know that these social media websites, they're pretty robust, but other servers might not be quite so robust. So a server that's serving a particular website, for example, if there's no backup in place and that server fails, then all of a sudden nobody can then access the services from that server. And when you do use servers, then of course you're trusting them with your data. Right? You have to trust them not to misuse that data. I mean, have you ever thought about what these social media companies actually do with all the data they have about you? And again, if we're using servers and lots of people are connected to a single server, then that can cause issues if lots of people are trying to access it at the same time. So, can you describe the role of a computer acting as a client? Well, the client requests services from a server. What about the role of the server? Well, the server hopefully satisfies the requests from the clients, but it also controls access to its resources, to its files. Let's have a look at some more examples. So websites I've mentioned, when your computer acts as a client, so you request files from a web server, and the software on a web server doesn't necessarily look too pretty. This is essentially what it can look like, just a simple little panel like this. Email. So when your computer is acting as an email client, you're using an email client program such as Outlook, or it might be the messaging app on your phone, and then that communicates with a mail server, somewhere it requests the ability to send a message, and it might request the server to tell the client if there's any new messages. File clients. If you use something like Google Drive or Microsoft OneDrive, Dropbox, etc., your computer can act as a client as it sends files to one of these services. And of course the server will then hopefully store all your files nice and safely. Last one, print servers. All right, when you print something on the network, that print job would sit on the print server, and then those jobs are gradually released and then printed. So you could log off, go somewhere else, and your document that you've printed will still print as normal. So that's client server. What about peer-to-peer? So how does the role differ? So it differs like this. With a peer-to-peer connection, you are connecting directly, or more or less directly, to another device. So when your computer's behaving as a peer, it's connecting directly to another peer on the network. So examples might be this. It's possible to connect two computers together with a USB cable, and in doing so you can form a very simple network where you can transfer files. You might have connected your smartphone to via Bluetooth to a speaker. That is forming a peer-to-peer network. So what about the characteristics? Well, we've already mentioned that there's a direct connection with a peer-to-peer setup. There's no centralized server, so we say it's decentralized. All of the devices have the same status, but it does mean that each peer is responsible for either allowing or denying access to its files, because it's possible to share files with a peer-to-peer connection. Now, of course, there's some benefits of computers when they're behaving as peers. It's less expensive to set up a peer-to-peer network. You don't need any expensive servers, particularly if you're sharing files. And if you do have multiple peers and one computer breaks or goes offline, as long as another peer has the identical file that you're after, for example, then you can still get access to that file. So there's a little bit more resilience with a peer-to-peer type setup. So there's no single point of failure. There's no servers. If a server goes offline, it doesn't matter with peer-to-peer, because multiple peers can provide the same service. But of course there are a few drawbacks in that there's no central server to back up all of your data for you. So if you've got some personal data that you don't want to share with lots of other peers on the network, but you're happy to store that on someone's server somewhere for safekeeping, like Google Drive or OneDrive, if that server goes down, then you won't be able to access your files. And in the case of peer-to-peer file sharing, we need to be careful about the data that we share with others, what we allow and what we disallow. So hopefully you can explain the difference between a client-server network connection and a peer-to-peer network connection. So with a client-server network connection, the server is controlling access to resources and satisfying requests from the client. And the client requests services from the server. And in a peer-to-peer network, each device has equal status, allowing files and devices, including printers, to be easily shared. And no one computer has control over others, i.e. they have equal status. So hopefully you can now describe a computer that's behaving as a client, describe one that's behaving as a server, and one that's behaving as a peer. And these are the 3 roles that you need to be aware of.